About 120 years ago, our presenter's great-grandfather or grandfather left sunny Staffordshire to come to the United States of America, hailing from the city of Litchfield. And our guest this evening tells me that there are still words that are existing in the family which are not in the common vocabulary of an American, which probably baffles some Americans when they hear him speaking with a bit of a Staffordshire, not dialect, but vocabulary. Our speaker this evening is a university professor in America. He's also one of those beasts that I like to make fun of sometimes. You can look behind him and you can see the war gaming equipment that's there. When he stops talking this evening, he's probably going to get his paintbrush out and start painting his figures if he's not lecturing. He's also a reenactor, so he likes to dress up. But apart from that, he is a published author, a considered expert on his period of history. And with that, Alex Burns, I'm going to hand over to you and let you give your presentation.
Thanks so much, Dudley. It's wonderful to be here with you all this evening. Now, it's a little earlier where I am in the States. As Dudley said, my name is Alex Burns. I'm a professor of history at a small Catholic college in Eastern Ohio. And for much of my life, my sort of abiding passion and interest has been 18th century military history. And since I've sort of come up through university, and so my postgraduate work has been largely focused on the experience of infantrymen in 18th century Europe and North America. And so I'd like to talk a little bit with you all about that tonight, and then move on maybe more specifically to what was the experience of the British infantrymen at some key moments in 18th century warfare. I'd just like to start out by thanking the Society. I've been a member, since I was in postgraduate work. Very, very wonderful to be a member. I've stayed with Society members when I've been over researching and traveling in Britain. Just incredibly grateful for the support and membership of the Society. I want to talk a little bit this evening about sort of our perception and our memory of 18th century warfare and 18th century soldiers. And frequently if we think about 18th century warfare, because I think I overestimate how much my students spend thinking about George Washington and Lord Cornwallis and their time mentally. I think about a great deal, obviously. For the average person, maybe not so much. We may remember them for the fancy uniforms that they wear, the colorful uniforms they wear, and sometimes I think there's even a reenactment society in Britain called Wars and Lace, or Lace Wars, or something like this. And so frequently, the formality is emphasized, and the structure and the decoration of 18th century warfare. That's the part that stands out to us. I mean, how could we take seriously like the fellow on the left who's in the Itzenplitz regiment of the Prussian military of Frederick the Great? He has a laced hat on, a three-cornered hat, and a wig. Often we say powdered wig in modern parlance, but it's probably his own hair that he's put powder into. Looking at something like this, looking at the sort of the lace from Maurier's sketches of the British Grenadiers, how seriously can we take this stuff? Is this a sort of period of warfare that's worth studying? Christopher Duffy, said in the introduction to his great military experience in the Age of Reason, is this a decorative interval in military history? And in both the realm of Hollywood and even in how historians write about this period, there's not much to change this perception that it was a decorative interval. And I'm sure some of you in the audience have been afflicted with Mel Gibson's The Patriot, sort of the film depicting rather inaccurately the later stages of the American War of Independence in the South. If you look at films like that, if you look at films like The Sovereign Servant, depicting the Great Northern War, that's what the stills are on this slide, you get a very structured and ordered vision of 18th century warfare. Soldiers march into close range. They're obeying their officers' commands almost robotically. The commands sing out, and the men sort of immediately obey. Both sides take turns firing. One side will deliver a volley, the other side will fire back. Almost, by some imperceptible law of war, so one side has chosen to go first. And they don't take cover. They stand there at close range. I mean, in films, maybe 25 yards or less, and getting destroyed by these large 68, 69 caliber musket balls that are being fired at very close range in the film. And then finally, after both sides have fired, maybe once or twice, there's a mutual charge into hand-to-hand combat. And the two sides, mix it up, and Mel Gibson, whoever, can kill his red-coated opponent. It may not come as a huge surprise. Very little of this straw man that I've just constructed for you there is accurate. And I will say, this is not just something that is present in film, is present in popular memory, is present among war gamers or reenactors. Sometimes you go to reenactments, you see they're firing at each other at very, very close range. This is also present in the writings of historians from other periods who are summarizing 18th century warfare, who will characterize 18th century warfare in sort of similar ways to this. And even some scholars who work on 18th century warfare write about 18th century combat, in infantry combat particularly, in this way. But I hope to demonstrate to you tonight that very little of this vision of the popular memory of 18th century warfare matches well to the sources that we have describing what it was like on these battlefields for Tommy Adkins and his friends back in the middle of the 18th century. And so I wanted to offer you, before we really get off and running tonight, a new model of 18th century infantry battle, one that sort of I have developed based on my archival research in sort of Britain and Germany and the United States and Canada. It's a little bit different than what we might get out of the movies, what we might get from Hollywood. These soldiers, they considered whether or not to obey their officers. They were not always just robotic automata following their officers' commands. They frequently aimed at their opponents, and as we'll see here in a minute, were taught to aim, and perhaps sometimes actually did follow through and aim on the battlefield against the enemy. They fought as skirmishers. Frequently, historians will claim that skirmishing was a development of Napoleonic warfare. Well, as you'll see tonight, very frequently on 18th century battlefields, men are deployed out in the advance in order to break up the enemy's formation, to make the main body of the battalion, perhaps their fight, a little easier. They fired at will. They fired independently without waiting for words of command from their officers. Frequently, they fired at what might seem like very long range from our modern perspective. We've grown up with this narrative that 18th century smoothbore muskets like Brown Bess are very inaccurate. And you have to hold fire till very close range in order to maximize your effectiveness. That's true. That's what officers wanted. The men didn't always follow through, though, on their officers' instructions to hold fire until very close range. Frequently, these men will not just march robotically to the beating of drums, and often they did not beat drums on the battlefield, but they did not keep cadence step. They ran on the battlefield when required. They took cover, sort of throwing themselves to the ground or behind hedges or behind stone walls or in buildings. And they really did not like to fight in melee combat. They preferred to engage the enemy from a longer range. The idea of closing with bayonets was not something that many 18th century soldiers relished. Frequently, the bayonet was an important weapon in the 18th century. It was a weapon of intimidation rather than a weapon that caused the majority of battlefield casualties in the 18th century. So with this model in mind, I want to take you through one source, both where I begin the book in 1733, which is not, I think, a date that really resonates with many people in the English-speaking world. And also, one of the quotes that really, when I ran across this, I thought, man, I've got to write this book. I've got to tell this different story of 18th century military history. And that quote is describing the Battle of Guastalla in northern Italy in the sort of 1734 during the War of Polish Succession. Frequently in Britain, in America, we kind of skip over the War of Polish Succession to talk about the War of Austrian Succession, or King George's Wars, as we call it over here in the States. That's because the British armies are involved. But it is a very important starting point in the story of the norms of 18th century warfare. And again, we will get to the Redcoats, I promise. We will talk specifically about British experience. This is to just sort of set the stage for what is normal in a broader context among 18th century infantry soldiers. Now, the man who I'm going to read from is himself from the British Isles. He's from Ireland. He's an Irish officer in the Austrian army who was present at this Battle of Guastalla between the Austrian Habsburgs and the French in northern Italy in 1734. And he's describing the attack or the advance of a battalion of Austrian grenadiers at the Battle of Guastalla in 1734. And so let's see what just delightful kind of Irish Germanic name, Johann Maguire von Inniskillen. We marched slowly with bayonets fixed, and when we were in the presence of the enemy, the prince ordered me to gallop from company to company and forbid on pain of death to fire without orders from him or from me. We make a bold front and march in good order until we come within 150 paces of them, when a grenadier fires and the others follow his example. The prince shouts, sabers it, hitting them with the flat of his sword, and makes incredible efforts to keep them from firing and get them to advance. He's talking about his own troops here. Count Gruna and I likewise do the utmost of our ability. Prince Louis of Württemberg runs up, sabers them also, while performing the duty of a grenadier as well as that of a general. Towards 4 in the afternoon, we retired to the village. We were posted in the morning. No company mustered more than 10 men. Those wretches, he's talking about his own troops now, very nice guy. The wretches who had nothing of the grenadier but the Busby got themselves slaughtered miserably. Instead of giving one volley and falling on the enemy with the bayonet, we did not kill more than 30 of them, and our fire was a little service. So I think I love this passage because it really gets at the heart of what I'm trying to talk about in the book. This dichotomy between what officers wanted to happen on the 18th century battlefields that we're discussing this evening, and what the enlisted men were actually willing to do. What did the officers want to happen at this battle? They wanted the grenadiers to march up, fire once, and then fall on the enemy with bayonet at close range. What actually happened? Well, the men parked about 150 paces away from the enemy and spent the whole afternoon firing away all their cartridges. So it's a vast difference between what the officers desire and what the actual outcome on the battlefield is. Now, the next few slides, we're just going to go through. I'll move through this fairly quickly so we can get to the British Army, talking about so each of the models that I discussed of what actually happened in 18th century battles, the men aiming their weapons, running on the battlefield, etc. Some evidence that this is in fact taking place. First of all, let's take a look at the Prussian army. Frequently, we remember the Prussian army of Frederick II or Frederick the Great in the 18th century as being a very rigid and orderly, disciplined, robotic army. Well, even the Prussians are being instructed in their infantry regulations to take aim when they're firing. The king, writing in 1750, notes, the officers must take care that the men stand firm upon their ground before they give the word present, and that they level well and take a good aim without any hurry. The men must take a good aim and look boldly into their fire. The officers must be careful to make them level straight. The musket butt must rest even with the shoulders, and the men sink their heads a little to take a better aim. And again, frequently when I'm talking to audiences in America, when I'm talking to audiences in Britain, the comment is, well, why on earth would you bother to aim? Brown Bess does not have a front sight or a back sight, and that is a rarity in 18th century musket design. The French Charleville musket has a front sight. The Prussian Potsdam musket has both a front sight and a back sight. The British indeed call the bayonet lug on the end of their musket the sight in period sort of terminology. So the idea that you couldn't aim muskets, they didn't have a sight, this isn't terribly accurate. In the American context, the British Army coming over and fighting in North America, really General Burgoyne preparing his men to go down and invade New York State from Canada in 1777. A German officer who's there, so one of the people we often remember as quote unquote the Hessians, it's actually a Braunschweiger, but the Hessians, notes how the British Army's training their men and sort of giving orders for the Hessians to do likewise. Basically, they're engaged in target practice. They're creating targets. The men are sort of engaged in practicing aimed fire. And I don't reproduce the whole quote here, but there's actually a monetary prize for, I think, the best 4 shots in each company. So again, there is aimed fire that's valued. In both the Prussian case and the British case, we know that this isn't just officers theoretically saying, hey, it would be nice if the men aimed. Let's do some target practice. The men do aim on the battlefield. At the Battle of Eutaw Springs in the American War of Independence in 1781, British marksmen, enlisted men who firing from the cover of a brick house, are picking off individual American officers and artillerymen from about 100 yards away with their smoothbore muskets. So there is an effort to aim at these individual enemy figures. Likewise, the Prussians, we know from the writings of Lieutenant Barsevich in the Prussian army in the 7 Years' War, that he calls out for men who he knows have a background as huntsmen to pick off mounted enemy officers as the enemy attack is coming in, and they're able to sort of go out and fulfill this order. So again, there is a priority of aimed fire, both in sort of prescription and also what actually happens on the battlefield. I won't belabor this point. Soldiers really fire independently almost all the time in 18th century battlefields. It's possible to maybe fire a battalion volley, but the narrative of 18th century warfare that the British army is distinct and the Prussian army is distinct because they can achieve platoon fire, whereas almost no one else in the 18th century world can do this. Even the British and the Prussians struggle to execute this actually on the battlefield. And you have a comment here from a Saxon officer, Johann Gottfried Hoyer, who says, what's the goal of 18th century officers? They want to bring the man under control, to do what he calls build an unfeeling shooting machine. Well, this is not successful. And indeed, he says, in the heat and confusion of battle, the instrument is only set in motion. So you could sort of move the troops to where they're going to be firing from, and then they're going to be loading and firing as fast as they possibly can. Sometimes the Prussians can achieve platoon fire, but this is a universal experience. He ends by noting, sort of across European militaries in the 18th century. So an independent fire, what's called a running fire, or in German a Plackerfeuer, is very common on these battlefields. The Prussian officers hate it. They write a lot about it in their sort of post-war accounts of how to better train the army for the next war. It is something that is endemic to 18th century infantry combat. In the British Army too, an army famed for its fire discipline, you have problems. In the War of Austrian Succession and sort of fighting against the Jacobites, you have comments from officers in sort of court-martial, after the Battle of Prestonpans. I shall only add, the fire of our foot was infamous. Puff, puff, and here it's almost like he's taking his car to a mechanic and sort of making the sound that he's heard on the battlefield. He's trying to describe the sound that the rolling fire or placker fire gives. No platoon that I heard, and they're not firing by platoons, although I have heard others in action near to the right say they heard 2. So 2 platoons fired individually before everyone just starts loading and firing as fast as they possibly can. Another officer in the run-up to the Battle of Fontenoy, I believe, he sees a general officer riding behind the lines and approaches this brigadier and asks him, well, when we advance to attack the French, what style of firing should we use? Should we fire by rank? Should we fire by platoons? What are your orders? And the brigadier comes back and gives him this reply: as to platoon or rank firing, I should be glad to see you perform either in action, but I own that I never did yet except at a field day or at a review. So it is again a rarity to see these in action. And if you read the entire book that this lecture was based, there's a lot of evidence to indicate that the 18th century officers are paranoid and concerned that they can do this on the drill square, but they can't seem to do it in practice. All right, the very famous quote describing the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. I'm not going to go through this at length. Simply note that it's another description of independent fire. The men were under no command by way of Hyde Park firing. That is to say, they're loading and firing as fast as they possibly can. This quote has been evaluated and criticized in recent years as the officer who sort of gives this was not very close to the fighting. I do think it matches well with the weight of the other evidence that I see as far as the reality of 18th century battle. I do think there's a lot of independent firing going on in these battles. Otherwise, I don't think the officers would be so wrapped around the axle, frustrated that this is happening in their post-war accounts. A final thought, again, from the British Army, this time in the War of Independence, Thomas Anbury describing his experience in the Saratoga campaign. In this action, I found that all the manual exercise has been an ornament, and the only object of importance that it can boast was that of loading, firing, and charging with bayonets. So again, this is there's a great vast disparity between what happens on the drill square and what happens in practice. This is, I think, the heart of what he's trying to say here. He also describes the idea that the men are tap loading their pieces; they're not ramming down cartridge, but after sort of dumping the cartridge in the mouth, they're slamming the musket butts on the ground to seat the cartridge. The Austrians do this as well at the Battle of Mollwitz in 1741. So it's not, I think, too much of a stretch to think that perhaps it happens in some of the very heavy firefights of the Burgoyne campaign, like the Battle of Freeman's Farm, where the firefight lasts for an extended period of time. Now, running on the battlefield, moving away from how are the men firing, how are they moving on the battlefield? Are they just sort of with their muskets shouldered, advancing, at a stately pace in good order towards the enemy? And I think frequently you do see examples of the men keeping in order, their officers paying attention to this. After the Battle of Leuthen in 1757, the Prussian king, Frederick the Great, noted, man, the men marched like they were on a review. And he's very pleased by this. I think pleased because it doesn't always happen. And so some examples we find in the sources of the men running on the battlefield come from that War of Polar Succession that I started this lecture with. A soldier who's with the Picardy Brigade sort of describes the movement in the actions of the War of Polar Succession, saying, we were summoned to the center, and where the fighting was heavy, we ran almost as in a race, the quickest arriving first. And so again, they're moving at great speed, trying to reposition battalions at different points in the battle line. A Prussian Fusilier officer describing the Battle of Prague on May 6th, 1757, says, in order to reach the position of advance to form the battle line, we had to pass a long dam, which delayed us. So in order to arrive at the correct time, we had to run past the village of Arnhem. The regiment was not in perfect order. He's kind of sheepish about this. The Austrian enemy were already advancing on us at the quick step, and we engaged them. So we hear both sides are moving with a degree of speed as they're moving to contact at Prague in 1757. Johann Jakob Dominicus, a Prussian musketeer at the Battle of Kunersdorf, says, while under an artillery bombardment, our left wing had its work cut out for it. We had to run with energy in order to get under the enemy guns, so to get out basically of the line of fire. This sort of comment is fairly common on these 18th century battlefields. The men, certainly the officers, would prefer to move with order, but when the situation demands, they'll move forward at a faster pace. Now, none of this, of course, is a reference to the normal fast pace that the British Army engaged during the American War of Independence. And I'll address that in a little bit further. But you see similar sort of comments from Hessians, like the von Bosse regiment, that are fighting with the British at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in 1781, where the commanding officer, at least commanding officer in the field of that regiment, says, in order to keep up the British, we had to run forward. The regiment was not in perfect order. Again, he's kind of sheepish at the level of speed that this is causing disorder in the course of these battles. Now, again, I would say broadly, soldiers did take cover on 18th century battlefields. You see a lot of references to this, and I'm going to talk more when I get to the British Army, because I think that was a special hallmark of theirs in the 18th century, sort of taking cover in the face of enemy fire. But at battles like the battles in northern Italy at Parma and Gustula in 1734, you see both the French and the Habsburgs, the Austrians, fighting in this manner. Comments later in the century, sort of talking with old officers who were there at these fights, basically said, we shouldn't allow any of our soldiers to kneel, because at the battles of Parma and Gustula, basically the entire infantry of our army knelt on the battlefield and fired at the enemy, and the entire enemy army was sort of kneeling down or lying down and firing back. Varnery, a Prussian officer who was in these battles earlier in his career, notes that the soldiers at these battlefields fought in the manner of Croats. Croatan art is sort of the verb that he's using. But basically, what's happening here is he's talking about guys like laying on their bellies and sort of firing from a prone position in the course of these fights. And again, I think we can ask, how representative are these battles in northern Italy? I think sometimes they might have been something of an outlier, but there were moments that called them back in the course of the 18th century. In 1758, when Abercrombie's British army is attacking the fortress of Ticonderoga or Carillon, the French are taking cover behind, crouching, taking cover behind breastworks, firing independently at the British as they're coming on. And the British are sort of seeking out whatever cover they can find, kind of firing back. And so the French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, writes in his after-action report, on both sides, the infantry firefight was like that at the Battle of Parma. And so these are moments that are kind of referenced in the minds of these officers as time goes on. As the 18th century wears on further, maybe the wars we're more familiar with, like the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, the War of Austrian Succession. These are battles that still loom large in the minds of the soldiers who fight. Okay, so it's maybe a broad baseline of what the experience of infantry battle was like across Europe at this time. I want to now turn and specifically talk for a few moments about the British Army in the 18th century. See if I can identify, for you all some features common maybe across a lot of these different wars for Tommy Atkins and his friends here in the British military. Some of this, of course, draws on the incredible research of Dr. Matthew Spring in his book With Zeal and Bayonets Only. If you've not yet gone out and read that, it came out in 2008, so I mean it's getting up there now, but a fundamental place to start if you want to tactically understand the British Army in the American War of Independence. Again, I'm going to try and go slightly beyond the War of Independence and reach further back into the century to try and chart what infantry battle was like for these men across these 18th century battles the British Army took part in. Now, I would say the War of Austrian Succession does not go down as being the pinnacle of British military success. Obviously, they defeat the Jacobites at Culloden, but it's not the sort of the high point of British military performance in the 18th century. And so a generation of younger officers, and you see some of them there, so their names and portraits listed on the slide, are engaged in a process of army reform. This army reform process is not always successful. The Duke of Cumberland certainly doesn't mold the army exactly how he wants. He gets a lot of pushback from Parliament. But in many ways, often, particularly in the realm of tactics on the battlefield, the British Army does reform, start to focus on things like aimed fire. In some ways, I think aimed fire becomes a special hallmark of the British Army in the 18th century. particularly in the French and Indian War. There are a lot of accounts that indicate the British are practicing aimed fire before the battles, and they're also able to execute this fairly well on the battlefield. Now, why are the British successful in the French and Indian War, in the 7 Years' War? This is a war the British Army fights globally. It's a world war, right? It's just annoyingly, when the anniversaries came around, starting in 2006, 7, 8, people started suggesting, well, we should call this World War Zero. Thank goodness that didn't catch on. But I do think it is absolutely important to remember the British Army's fighting in North America. Obviously, that's something near and dear to my heart as someone who lives in the United States. Also fighting over in sort of the Western Holy Roman Empire, or Western Germany, we would say today, deployed to the subcontinent of India, even to places like the Philippines, obviously the Caribbean. It's a global war. I would say the British are successful by and large because they're willing to experiment and adapt in the French and Indian War, in the 7 Years' War globally. The British are fighting in ways that show a great deal of appreciation, particularly if you move through some of the disasters that occur early in that war, like the slaughter on the banks of Monongahela in 1755. The British Army begins to try and really adapt itself well to North America. And also the British Army is performing quite well in continental Europe, where we just had the anniversary of Minden Day, beginning of the month. At battles like Minden, the British regiments show that they're capable both of adapting well to North American service, but also fighting very successfully against French cavalry in continental Europe. Now, in North America, obviously, as you can see from the artwork here, the British are adapting their uniforms. They're adopting maybe even Native American styles of carrying their equipment. They're cutting down their cocked hats into sort of round hats. This is not something that occurs universally across the British Army, but is particularly prominent in the middle years of the war, and continues in some ways for much of this war. Even when the war concludes, in the image on the left there is the fight against Pontiac and Native American warriors in the Bushy Run in August 5th and 6th, 1763. So whether they're fighting against French, militia, Native American warriors, the British Army is fairly successful, is able to, naval supremacy helps a great deal, obviously, but is able to conquer all of Canada, in addition to holding off the French in Central Europe during the 7 Years' War. I think a lot of that comes down to the adaptability and the army reform process that the British Army engaged in the years after, say, 1748, when the War of Austrian Succession comes to an end. Now, as we move through these wars, what can we say tactically about the experience of British soldiers, British officers in the War of Austrian Succession, 7 Years' War, even later? Well, this is an image of what will become, I think, I don't know if it's there yet, the Royal Highland Regiment at the Battle of Fontenoy. The Scots here are clapping to the ground when the French present to fire. They throw themselves to the ground in order to let the sort of musket balls pass over their heads. Sometimes this is claimed this is a particularly Scottish way of fighting. This isn't present in the British Army as a whole. I think if you look at what's actually going on in a lot of these battles, the British talk about taking cover quite frequently. Regular English British soldiers like Samson Staniforth, described with seeing a French battery of cannon preparing to fire, and the whole regiment sort of throws themselves on the ground to avoid becoming casualties. And despite that, even some are hit with the way canister works. This is something the British military does embrace to I would say more or less effective degree. Having the men take cover, having the men lay on their arms in the face of enemy fire. It's a through line you see from the War of Austrian Succession all the way up through the American War of Independence. You see comments from the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, where Corporal Todd on one of the amphibious descents on the coast of France says we got out of the longboats and immediately threw ourselves to the ground so the artillery from the ships could fire over our heads. So again, this is something that can both facilitate outgoing fire in addition to something that protects the men when they're under incoming fire. In the War of Independence, you do see the British continue to employ this as a fairly standard tactical practice in their toolkit. Sometimes even going as far as to throw themselves to the ground and stand up and fire, and then throw themselves to the ground again when the Americans are prepared to fire back on them. You have comments such as, I ordered my company to lie down and cover themselves, not only lie down, but cover themselves with brushwood in order to prevent being seen as marks. So this style of fighting is something that starts maybe in the 1740s, but continues with the British Army through into all the way through the War of Independence, and indeed we know from the Napoleonic Wars afterwards. Now, again, a lot of this is not research that is native to me, but it was conducted by Dr. Spring in his incredible book, The Seal with Bayonets Only. What can we say broadly about the British style of fighting in the War of Independence? They fight in open order in a two-rank line. They're moving very swiftly. Units are moving swiftly, firing once, and then trying to charge with bayonets in order to drive the Americans off the battlefield quickly. They're trying to avoid long, drawn-out firefights in the course of these battles. It doesn't always happen. Freeman's Farm, for example, is a long, drawn-out firefight, but this is the goal. And I think Burgoyne is very chagrined if you read his orders directly after the Battle of Freeman's Farm. He says, stop shooting at them so much. Just go right in with the bayonet. This is how we're going to win these battles. Flexible and aggressive thinking dominated the British military in this war. It's one of the reasons why they were so tactically successful. The British do not lose the Revolutionary War for want of tactical success. If you look at the sort of litany of the battles of the American War of Independence, time and again, the British are at least tactically, if not operationally, strategically successful as they engage the American Army, the Continental Army on these battlefields. Okay, so just a sort of few more slides here, and I'll open it up to you all for questions. As I said, a two-rank open order line of battle is adopted as standard, particularly for General Howe's army in the course of the fighting. We know that some of the sort of Germans, the Hessians, quote unquote, fight in this style as well, particularly those who come south as Burgoyne. There are orders from the Hesse-Hanau regiment, for example, but they are also opening up their files, leaving space, as you can see here in the photograph, in between those files. And obviously, this is not a colorized photograph of the 18th century, right? These are reenactors, who I trust are sort of just displaying what's in the drill manuals. I think for me, one of the most interesting comments on fighting between British regiments and the Continentals in the American War of Independence comes from the action at Three Rivers in July of '76. And here you have a comment again from a German officer, the Freiheit Riedesel, who's trying to explain what fighting is like in North America for maybe an audience back in Germany. He's talking to a British officer. So the brigadier went to meet them on the road to Montreal and came across their column. He halted and gave orders for one of the English regiments to lie down, and in this position sent one well-placed volley after another at the enemy. So again, if your level of understanding is of the American War of Independence is the Patriot, here that the British are Mel Gibson, and the Americans are guys getting kind of slaughtered down there in the open. I think it's very interesting sort of turning this popular narrative on its head. This was all the more successful as it was in a dense forest where they met the rebel column. The enemy took flight in the utmost confusion at this unexpected firing. So very successful engagement, which the British are using firepower, fighting in a flexible manner in order to sort of drive off an American advance. You see similar comments. Why are the British doing it? What is prompting this experience? Well, Riedesel continues this. The English make it one of their chief rules and principles in this country that no maneuvers may ever be carried out in serried ranks, closed order, guys all packed together like sardines. In these districts that are so terribly wooded, they found that out to their cost in the last war against the French in North America, which they were always unsuccessful at the commencement until they had taught their men to maneuver with open ranks and cover themselves by means of trees. after which they were always successful. So again, what is prompting this in the British sort of officers' minds? Well, it's the experience of the French and Indian War. The lessons they learned in that war are absolutely still present and with the army in the American War of Independence. Now, again, if you've not read Dr. Spring's book, here's a plug for his book. Definitely check this out. This is if you want to tactically understand what the British military is doing in the War of Independence. I would say, that, in my opinion anyway, that there's no better place to begin. British soldiers are also, as they are engaged in these fast-moving advances to try and drive the enemy off the battlefield with bayonets, famous for sort of cheering, to intimidate the American forces. There are different, even like at a brigade level, orders given out in the British Army at different times. James Wolfe, the French and Indian Wars, that dies at Quebec fame, is not a fan of cheering as you're going into a charge. He thinks you should remain silent. This is more intimidating. In the War of Independence, at least in several key battles of the Southern campaign, the British do cheer as they're coming on to try and intimidate the American forces. I think this is a pretty common method of launching these attacks. Just a few words about the American army and the way they fight the way they do, why they fight the way they do. Frequently, we remember the War of Independence as Americans with rifles, sort of picking off the British. And as I've already said, I don't really fall into that line of interpretation of why the United States wins the American War of Independence. I think things like logistical issues for the British military and probably the French Navy, he explained it maybe a little bit better, in addition to the Continental Army and the training they receive, particularly in the later stages of the war. But riflemen are a huge part of the popular memory, not just now, but also the discourse as the revolution was going on. A soldier who had served in the 15th Regiment of Foot during the French and Indian War, sort of retired in America, became a settler basically in North Carolina. And he kind of writes in his diary about events to the lead up of the revolution that even before the serious fighting starts, that essentially Americans are telling themselves, we're going to win this war quickly because we're all, sort of trained marksmen. His comment literally in this diary entry is, the patriots of America were marksmen from their youth. This is what they're telling themselves as they're trying to sort of pump themselves up to go fight. Whereas the British soldiers, as a result of acts of parliament, did not grow up around firearms. So a society that is familiar with firearms is going to defeat a society that's maybe not familiar with firearms. And again, I don't dispute that the long rifle played a very important role in sort of the small actions in the War of Posts in the American War of Independence. It's a key at several moments in say the Battle of Saratoga. But I don't think if you look at the battlefield record of who wins and loses on the battlefield of the American War of Independence, that you can in good conscience say, oh, it's a society with firearms always triumphing over a society that doesn't have access to firearms. I don't think it's quite that simple. And indeed, the record might suggest that something else is going on there. I do think, and not uniquely, both sides are sort of experimenting and adopting with different styles of projectiles. The American military and the British are both using buck and ball ammunition. And you can see an example of a musket ball there with a small caliber butt shot still attached. It's ammunition that is known in Europe. It's actually a hallmark of the Russian army in the 18th century. They load a musket ball and then 9 buckshot in their cartridges. But both the Americans and the British use this ammunition as fairly standard in the War of Independence. And indeed, right before the Battle of Saratoga, General Gates is writing letters saying, man, I need more buckshot for cartridges. I have plenty of musket balls, but I need some more buckshot in order to sort of get the army ready to fight in what will become the Saratoga campaign. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this letter from John. Simply, John Adams, our second president, again, is kind of harping on this idea that American firepower is what separates them from the British. But if you look at the vision that American officers have for how to best use firepower it's in many ways a British vision. This shouldn't surprise us to a great degree. Washington comes of age in the 1740s and 1750s. Obviously, as a young man, at 22 years old, he's off in the Pennsylvania wilderness fighting on behalf of the British Empire. His vision for how he wants the Continental Army to fight the American War of Independence seems very much like the vision of an officer, quite normal, from the 1750s. He believes you've got to hold your fire until very close range. And when the enemy is, he writes, if the enemy is 25 yards away when you deliver the volley, I have no doubt if they're always being repulsed. So again, there is this desire to close with the enemy, fire a volley at very close range, shatter the enemy formation. You see that among British officers writing in the 1740s and 50s. You see that among American officers writing in the 1770s and 80s. That's a philosophy that does mark the British way of war, I think, in the course of the 18th century. The question is, how often did the men actually follow through and execute this? And at least in Washington's case, he is horrified by the results of trying to pursue this policy. You can see sometimes the men will follow through and hold their fire until very close range, but much more frequently they will give fire at a longer distance, or what Washington calls throwing away their fire. And so it's maybe one of the great ironies of British and American sort of tactical history, that you see complaints from figures like James Wolfe at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743 that mirror very closely complaints from George Washington about the style of fighting in the Continental Army. That in both of these instances, the soldiers, be they British soldiers or North American, sort of continental soldiers, they're throwing away their fire. They're firing too quickly. Both Washington and Wolfe resort to complaints, pleading, threats of death, to try and get the men to sort of hold their fire until very close range. Sometimes this works. I think more often than not, as you can see from the charts, trying to hold fire until under 30 yards. Maybe the Continentals achieve it a quarter of the time. Is it the way to win battles? It's the way to keep men under control, to keep the battle moving swiftly. It also requires an intense psychological toll from the men who take part. And so perhaps if there's something to be said, exceptional about this sort of tactical British way of war in the 18th century, it's that the officers maybe have trust and hope that their men will actually be able to follow through on this very psychologically demanding tactical doctrine, when they know from the French experience, the Austrian experience, Prussian experience, that much more frequently soldiers are firing at 200 yards, 250 yards. A normal firefight range might be something about 100 yards. This is the norm in 18th century warfare, and the British, and to some extent Washington, and people influenced by the British, are trying to change this. Thank you so much for your attention tonight. I look forward to your questions. Dudley, if you want to come back on stage and facilitate this for us.
Alex, excuse me, that was fascinating. I'm taking some Americans to Preston Pans and Culloden next month. This will stand me in good stead. As I explained to lots of people on these talks, this is not really my period of history, and therefore I'm not going to ask any questions now, because we are not short of questions, Alex. The chat box has been flooded with them. So let me put up the first question from Tom, who's asked, did fighting in the Caribbean have any lasting tactical impact on the British Army, or form a West Indies school or method of war?
That's a very good question. I mean, I would say in some ways it serves the British Army in very good stead, and you see amphibious operations completed successfully in the Caribbean. That is true in the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. It's true in the American War of Independence. It's true in the all the way up through the Napoleonic era, 1794 on. I would say, in terms of what actually tactically is happening, not during sieges, but actual field battles in the Caribbean. Well, field battles in the Caribbean are fairly rare. But the comments that you get from, say, the fighting on Saint Lucia in 1778, these soldiers say, well, we kept about 200 yards in between us and the enemy. So it's not necessarily again, trying to take cover, trying to fire at a longer range. It's fairly common in the Caribbean. In the same way, it's fairly common in North America and in Europe. I don't know that necessarily in the environment of the Caribbean shapes tactical battles. Obviously, there are much more sieges and assault operations that happen in the Caribbean. Not a huge number of very well-developed 18th century star fortresses in North America. There are a large number in the Caribbean. So maybe there is a West Indies school to do with sieges. That's not something I looked into. I'd research more and get back to you on that.
Thank you. Excuse me. Stephen's obviously read your book, because he starts by saying you started your book study with the War of the Polish Succession, but how much earlier do you think your battle format concept goes? Is it true for the War of the Spanish Succession and earlier, or does it come in with the abandonment of the pike around 1703-5?
Yeah, very good. So if you've read my book, you know that I reference this happens even earlier, right? At the Battle of Nördlingen in the 30 Years' War. The Spanish infantry is throwing themselves onto the ground when the Swedes are delivering volley fire. It's how common is it in that period? That's a really good question. I struggle to find really, really great low-level descriptions of tactical battles in the 30 Years' War. I'm sure they're out there, but as I kind of note at the end of the book, I really would love for some young, more linguistically gifted historian than I am to come through and write the story of how firearms have impacted infantry warfare from 1500 on with these things in mind. So is it the bayonet, as you suggest? Is it just the firearm itself? This style of alternatively taking cover and giving fire. If we can see it in the 30 Years' War, that doesn't indicate that there's a huge revolution with the bayonet. As far as the War of Spanish Succession, I do think that's a war where absolutely British officers and Dutch officers are very kind of wrapped up around the axle in the same way they are in the 7 Years' War period, but trying to get the men to fire by platoon and sort of firing by rank and more complicated firings. How successful are they? I don't know. I'd have to go back into the archives and sort of research that period. I think you could see some of the early beginnings of this style in the French way of war, trying to defend these positions and villages and sort of dams like they do in the War of Polish Succession, back in the War of Spanish Succession era. Frequently, combats over villages are very intense in the War of Spanish Succession. But yeah, that's something I'd really have to research a good deal more to give you a complete answer.
Great, thank you. Mark, I don't think Mark is taking issue with your dates, but is 1733 to 1783 a developmental period or steady state? Do the conclusions only apply at the end of this period or throughout?
Yeah, so I guess I would say in terms of how men psychologically respond to the conditions of battlefields, I don't think there's a huge change between 1733 and 1783. I do think that maybe some of the how officers are thinking about these problems, and indeed just the development of Prussian mania and the desire for everyone to emulate Prussian tactics. They're hoping that by emulating the Prussians, that their soldiers will never fall into disorder and will always be able to sort of execute platoon firings and sort of more complicated firings by division, etc. This is not something that works very well for these folks who are adopting Prussian style tactics, because it's not something that even works very, very well for the Prussians themselves. The advantage of cadence marching, the advantage that the Prussians have is really speed in the pre-battle maneuvers. once the fighting really starts, Prussian officers comment, yeah, once the shooting begins, either the massive men under our command is going to go forward, it's going to go backwards. There's not a lot we can do to control what happens. So again, I would say there are developments like the effort to try and bring soldiers more tightly under control following the Prussian model. But in terms of how men psychologically respond to the battlefield, I think it's fairly steady throughout.
Thomas poses a devil's advocate question.
Very good.
I wonder how much the pop culture image promoted, particularly by Hollywood or the British and Europeans, never aiming, always firing volleys like robots, vis-a-vis the smart, individualistic Americans firing rifles and picking off their enemies at range, the latter, of course, being better soldiers, contributes to the general view of the 18th century soldiers never aiming and just shooting at a general and amorphous target area.
Yeah, so that's a really great thought, and I think I agree in the 18th century, but I mean, if you look at depictions of Napoleonic warfare, I mean, I'm not saying they're all like this, and some of them aren't even this good, right? I mean, the most recent Napoleon film was absolutely atrocious, but depictions tactically of the Napoleonic Wars fall into the kind of this same mold of, the guys in the bright red coats and marching up slowly and firing, but there, of course, it's Sean Bean and his individual riflemen who are the smart fellas who are taking cover and things like this, as opposed to the poor normal benighted infantrymen who are standing there getting shot. So again, I think whether it's Hollywood doing this to promote these in American values of individualism, or it's the smart soldiers from I guess it's the north of Britain if it's Sean Bean, compared with the French and others. I do think that it probably contributes broadly to this myth that soldiers didn't try to aim their weapons. And again, if you and there are photographs of all these muskets online, but if you look at Swedish muskets and Russian muskets and Prussian muskets and French muskets, most of them have sights, right? And so at the very least, the people who are designing the muskets have some sort of expectation that these weapons are going to be aimed at least in a rudimentary way.
Mark asks, do you have any thoughts on whether British officers received any instruction or training on the more open and fast-moving tactics used during the American Revolution? This must have put a great deal of responsibility on the shoulders of company-level officers and NCOs. So I
think there's some great work on that by a historian over on your side of the water, assuming, Mark, that you're in the UK, which I obviously I saw some folks from Canada and whereabouts. So yes, there are training camps in Ireland in the period before the war, where British soldiers and officers kind of working together in some ways. At least the light infantry are being trained in this more flexible and aggressive style. It does demand a lot of company level officers and NCOs, and for that, again, I'd really encourage you to sort of go after Dr. Spring's book. He talks a lot in that work about the way that responsibilities of command are falling further down onto the battalion or maybe even the company level in some of these actions. It really does demand a lot of the men, and they're able to do this quite well. It leads, particularly in the 1776 and 1777 campaigns, to incredible tactical results. There's a school of thought, people like General Clinton, later in the war, who said, this is the reason we lose the war. Disasters like cowpens happen because we were extending the lines too far. We don't have sort of a solid body. I mean, even as early as the first Battle of Savannah in I think late 78, early 79. Have to check the date. The open order British line struggles to break through a pretty determined American resistance, and actually it's a closed order Hessian battalion that comes through and sort of breaks the line open. So I think there are disadvantages to it as the Americans can gain and grow in quality. it becomes less feasible to launch fast-moving attacks in this way.
Sean asks, do you know the extent to which this style of fighting persisted into the Napoleonic Wars?
Absolutely not. Everything worth studying in the universe ends in 1789. No, I'm only joking, of course. I would say if you look at the experience, now I'm not a Napoleonic historian, and so I'm very confident that many Napoleonic historians would take issue with this, and historians are really only very helpful in their own subfield, at least in my opinion. If you look at the way the British Army fights in the Napoleonic Wars, even to some extent the case that the way that the all Napoleonic armies fight, they have made stuff like this a bit more normal and in the mainstream. Like skirmishers are a normal part of most Napoleonic armies, really all throughout the period, but certainly by the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The idea of the British lying down, on the reverse slope, sort of trying to avoid incoming fire. I don't necessarily think that's something, new that, the Duke of Wellington says, oh, no one's ever thought about lying down while you're getting shot at before. I think it's something you see in this period. In some ways, Wellington refines it, right? So this is, I would say, one way that continues into the Napoleonic period. But again, I'm not a Napoleonic historian. I'd really point you to the work of people like Rory Muir, Tactics and the Experience of Battle in the Age of Napoleon. That would be probably a better way to answer that question. Not something I have looked into a great deal.
Samuel asks, how much is the open order seen as a British way of war, or is it a British way of war in America? Open order is debated at whether it would be successful in Europe, where cavalry is more effective. And given that many officers saw warfare in Europe as the true test of martial skill, would this way of war be considered proper military doctrine?
Yeah, the absolutely right question. It's a question the British Army has an enormous fight about when they get done fighting the American War in 1783. There's a lot of debate. Do we continue to sort of form an open order, or do we, sort of in a derisive way, the proponents of the quote-unquote German school, of the Prussian school of style of fighting, they say, well, that's loose files in American scramble. We wouldn't want to do that in continental Europe. Cavalry absolutely plays an important role in why the British are able to do this. It's something I try to emphasize with my undergraduate students. What's different about the war in North America? Well, there's still cavalry. Cavalry's present in North America. Like there aren't any horses in America. But with heavy shock cavalry, wearing armor and things like this is not really a feature of the American experience in the same way that it is in Europe. And so absolutely, I think that plays a role to a large extent. That Sir David Dundas, who's taking notes on the Prussian reviews in 1774 and 1785, who's saying, man, we should try to make the army less like it was in the American War and more like the Prussian army. And I think to some extent, Professor Hugh Davies has obviously looked at this a great deal in Wandering Army, another really great book everyone should go read. It's to some degree a marriage of these two things that helps make the British Army as effective as it was in the Napoleonic Wars. The legacy that comes out of America, and also the experience that it has essentially from doing military observation in Europe in the 1770s and 1780s.
Yeah, Wandering Army, it's on the shelves behind me. Dave asks, in your book, you discuss ammunition use, suggesting that infantry often used up all the supply they carried in pouches. Armies responded by increasing the amount of ammo carried and used replenishment carts. Wargamers hate ammo rules as it involves chits or records. In light of your research, can we still abstract this by ignoring ammo supply? I don't know if that's an infantry question or a wargamer question.
Well, either way, it's a question from my people. So yeah, that's delightful, and yeah, let's think about this in sort of for a moment. I guess I would say across all of these armies, the British Army carries extra ammunition in tumbrils, sort of one-wheeled, or not one-wheeled, but two-wheeled carts behind the lines. The Prussian army, it has a huge ammunition reserves. Its trains they kind of bring up in the course of the fighting at the Battle of Leuthen, where it looks like maybe some of the soldiers fired off as many as 180 rounds in the course of that 4-hour long battle. This is don't resort to chits and record keeping. I mean, no one wants to do that. Here's what I would say. Maybe if you've been in if you fired for a certain number of turns, roll a check and see if the drummer boys have gone back to get enough ammunition and bring it back to the band. I mean, the Austrian army at Prague and Kolin literally sends the drummer boys back and reverses the drum heads and loads as many cartridges as they can in the drums and runs them back to the front line. So I mean, maybe we do something like that as opposed to keeping track of. I have 18 shots and I have to, put marks on, put a dice behind each one of my battalions to see, what's happening. After you've been firing for so many turns, roll a check and, see if you've got more ammunition. And if not, then maybe bad things start to happen. That's what I'd say.
We've got into the weeds of wargaming now, Alex.
Clearly, I'm not complaining, right?
Tom asks, did the British suffer particularly due to the practice of billeting, i.e. not having battalions fully formed for most of their peacetime service?
Yeah. I don't know if we're throwing me softballs, so I'll try to sell other people's books or not, but you should really read John Holding's book, Fit for Service. It's an entire book-length treatment of this question, where across the 18th century, where essentially he makes the argument that the British military is not as effective as other European militaries because they don't do large-scale exercises. They don't bring enough battalions together in order to sort of simulate, realistic war games in the same way, say, the Prussian reviews. Certainly, the British military is capable of beating rebel Americans. I mean, I don't know that the tactical issues are the problem. The British Army performs quite well in the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, the War of Independence. I'd say it performed quite well in the Napoleonic Wars. I don't know that this is an insurmountable issue. I do think that it's not necessarily a positive mark on the British Army and something that there's maybe a little bit more spin-up time in actual wartime as you're preparing the men to fight as a result of this practice kind of parceling out the regiments all across the country.
Yeah, I think campaigning brings on improvements in tactical skills quite quickly. Mark has asked, in your book, you describe the benefits the Prussian army derives from the cantonal system, the value of units serving with fellow villagers, and the continued contact with their civilian community. Is this still true of that army in the latter stages of the 7 Years' War? Are most units heavily diluted with random replacements due to heavy losses? And does this change the performance of regiments being more detached from these local connections?
I'm delighted to answer a question about the Prussian army as I'm speaking to a primarily British audience here. So thank you very much. I don't know if you're a plant in the audience or what it is, but I would say it kind of depends. So if, for example, if you look at the experience of the Itzenplitz regiment in the 7 Years' War, first couple of campaigns, a lot of the chaff kind of deserts. The men who aren't in cantonists, they're not native Prussians. They don't want to be there. They get out of the army. They use the opportunity of sort of being in the field in order to make good their escape from the Prussian army. All of the men who are essentially draftees from native Prussians, Brandenburgers and Prussians, they fairly highly motivated. Their high motivation, the quality of that army probably lasts into the middle of the years of the 7 Years' War, depending on the regiment. In the case of the Itzenplitz regiment, it lasts until the Battle of Hochkirch in October of 1758, where that regiment takes 800 casualties, assaulting a battery of cannon down a street in a village. So again, a lot of the native cantonists who are very highly motivated, experienced soldiers are tragically erased. I worked with a letter collection from that regiment, and it ended with a Todesnachricht, right? So it's like a death report back home to their family, like, yeah, you guys got killed at the Battle of Hochkirch. In other regiments, it's possible it lasts longer. There are letters from Prussian soldiers in 1762 and 1761 that are displaying the same level of I won't say fanatical, but very determined patriotism, that, hey, God is still with us, or this belief in, pietist Lutheran God, and Frederick the King, these two figures together are going to sustain us. That's still there late in the war. It's probably there in maybe a more diluted context. But in 1762, a lot of the prisoners of war from Russia are let back into the Prussian army. The Prussian army gains access to a lot of the canton districts that have been under Russian occupation. So I do think there's an argument to be made that there's maybe an uptick in quality again in the Prussian army at the very end of that war in 1762. And you'll have to, wait a while. This is my lifelong passion project, as I'm writing a campaign history of the Prussian army in the 7 Years' War in 1762. So I'll stick with me for the next 20 years. I'll see what I can do for you here.
Gary asks, what does independent fire in 3 ranks look like?
Gary's asking the right question. Yeah, no, it doesn't, right? It's very challenging because what's supposed to happen, right? The front rank's kneeling when you're firing in 3 ranks. Well, they're supposed to stand back up as soon as they've fired and reload. Well, a whole bunch of guys are not really anxious to stand back up. If you're popping off as fast as you possibly can, you're liable to get your head blown off by the guy in the 3rd rank. And so this is one of the things that officers in the 1770s and 1780s point to, is saying we should do away with kneeling entirely, because the men in the front rank will just lie on their bellies for much of the battle. These ranks break down, and realistically, you're probably not, you don't even have a 3 rank line anymore. You sort of bunching, where the guys are trying to work their way to the front of the formation and fire, and then maybe get back into the mass while they're reloading. It's incredibly chaotic. The rank structure, this in the Prussian context and the British context, the idea of locking on, sort of being slightly offset, requires a great deal from the men, and probably goes out the window as soon as the firing starts, if you believe the comments of these Prussian and British officers in the course of the 18th century. Yeah, great question. It doesn't really work in 3 ranks.
I think I've covered most of the questions. I just want to put up some of the comments and observations this evening. Let me just find one that's, Christopher's basically said, "You have changed my perceptions this evening. Thank you."
It's always gratifying to hear. I'm glad you enjoyed the talk.
And Robert has said, "Thank you very much. Working as an archaeologist at the Battle of Dettingen, your ideas are important to me."
Well, bless you. I hope your work goes well. We'd love to see better battlefield archaeology coming out of European battlefields as a whole. I've got one of my dear friends. You saw the results of some of his labors is Professor Grzegorz Podruczny. He teaches in Poland on the Kunersdorf battlefield, and has been doing archaeology there and at Zorndorf for the last 20 years. So it's thankless labor, but it's labor that, man, you'll change what we think. It's incredibly vital.
Nate's made this observation, which I wholeheartedly concur with, which is, he's saying we're trying to organize battalion level firing in a time before radio seems wildly optimistic. Related to this, I wonder if part of the problem is that historians weren't soldiers themselves. Someone with real infantry experience, even today, could tell you that there is what is supposed to happen and what happens. And I always say this about doctrine. Doctrine's written but rarely read. People later say, well, the doctrine said you should have done this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think I broadly agree. Yeah.
And Thomas has said, man, how many times have we heard that nobody thought of the Baylit log as a front site?
Yeah.
Alex, I think we've exhausted the questions this evening. It only remains for me to thank you on behalf of the Society for a really interesting and popular talk this evening. Unfortunately, there were a number of people that could not get into the room because it was full at capacity. And so if you're one of those people watching this on recording, my apologies to you, but at least you have the recording. I'm going to draw stumps now and give Alex the opportunity to get his paintbrushes out and start finishing off some of those unfinished soldiers behind him. Alex, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you
It's been a pleasure hosting this talk with you this evening. I look forward to meeting you in person at some stage.
That sounds wonderful.
Everybody else this evening, good night, and thank you for coming.